Good morning, and I'd like to welcome members, our witnesses, and those joining the 10th meeting of 2020. This is the 5th meeting of the committee that has been conducted remotely, and once again, before I begin, I'd like to thank the broadcast team on behalf of the committee for making this meeting possible. So, if I can turn us to item 1 of our agenda, please. The first item is a decision to take item 4 in private. And given the complexities of a group discussion over video conferencing, I'm assuming everyone agrees unless you indicate otherwise. I'll pause for any objections. Okay, thank you very much. So that's item 1 agreed. Right, now moving to item 2, our main item of business this morning is taking evidence on our inquiry on COVID-19 and its impact on Scotland's businesses, workers and economy. So on that basis, I'm very pleased to welcome. We have Fiona Hyslop, Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture, Gary Gilespie, the Chief Economist, and Kevin Quinlan, Director for International Trade and Investment. I'm going to start this morning by inviting the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening speech. Ms. Hyslop.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Committee, and thank you for the opportunity to update the Committee on the economic response to COVID-19. I wrote to the Committee Convener on the 22nd of May to provide an update, and I hope today we can further update the Committee, but also I'm very keen to hear your views as well, and we have a debate this afternoon in the Parliament, and that'll be another opportunity to have the Parliament express its views as to what we should be doing in response to COVID, but also what we can do in terms of recovery. As you realise that the public health crisis of COVID-19 is absolutely now an economic crisis, and we're having to respond to make sure that we can support our businesses and carefully restart our economy. As you're aware, we set out an economic plan in 4 stages: response, reset, restart and recovery. The response has focused on protecting lives, critical services, businesses and household incomes. We have set out a very unique package of business support of more than £2.3 billion to reflect the specific needs of Scotland's economy. That includes rates relief, it includes small business grants, specific grants for retail, hospitality and leisure, seafood and fisheries. And in terms of the amounts on the small grants, the latest information, which was a week ago, was something like £790 million. Been distributed to almost 70,000 businesses, and those figures should be updated tomorrow as well. The support extends beyond the consequentials identified and passed on by the UK government, and indeed in terms of that support we've identified that the business support consequentials from the UK government has currently indicated that level at £2.253 billion, and the Scottish Government has allocated an additional £94 million as part of its 2.347 package of business support measures. On reset, the activity has specifically focused on sector by sector guidance for different sectors of our economy, working in partnerships with a range of bodies, businesses, business organisations, trade unions, regulators as well, to prioritise activity based on the phasing that has been set out in the route map. So we've already published guidance on manufacturing, retail, construction, household waste centres, forestry and food and drink sectors, and we'll continue to publish update guidance in the coming days and weeks. So guidance alone will not be able to support restart. We also need to make sure that we've got advice, compliance and enforcement, and having a joined up approach to workplace public health measures. And that's why the joint statement with the HSE, police, local authorities and government published last week is important. On recovery, there's an opportunity for us to renew our economy, build resilience. Resilience is going to be critical in terms of our forward-looking approach. We need to harness innovation, the skills and strength of our businesses to ensure that Scotland can thrive, and to create that inclusive net zero, a wellbeing economy that I think has a consensus in Scotland. So we also need to help businesses to innovate and to adapt their business models to meet the changing demands. We also need to make sure that we're retraining and reskilling people to ensure that they can have good and sustainable jobs. The Fair Start Scotland Fund of £33 million in 2021 is supporting those that are most vulnerable to COVID-19. And we'll also be looking to experts, and that's why we've set our independent advisory group on the economy and economic recovery to look at all the different aspects of this, to draw on as many people's advice and intelligence as possible and ideas. And we're expecting them to publish their recommendations at the end of June. And we're also seeking to collaborate with other wellbeing economy governments. We are a founding member, and I think as we go forward, that international perspective will be helpful for us as well. So thank you to the committee for giving me the opportunity to update you. I'm interested in your insights, and also will answer your questions to my best ability. Those I can't answer directly, I will respond after the committee to you in writing.
Okay, thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. So we're going to move to questions from members now. I'll take each member in turn. And as I said, if anybody wishes to ask any supplementaries on a particular question, if they can just indicate that to me. So we're going to go to our first member now, and remember to give a moment for your microphone to come on. So I'm going to move to Richard Lyle first, please. Richard.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I know many businesses have received funding, and you're certainly trying your very best. But as MSPs, we've all received emails from constituents who do not qualify or are having difficulty in getting any funding package. Self-employed wedding planners, photographers, small businesses working from home, and coach companies. Can you, given that we are now over 2 months into the COVID-19, as part of the response phase, business support measures, is there any more the Scottish Government can do for those businesses that have and are falling through the cracks?
Okay, to take some of the examples, and I probably first of all should say that, and I've said this before, that both the Scottish Government and the UK's plans and responses and grants were based on the rates system, because they would be very swift, and that also by necessity meant that they were simple. That's why we've tried with our three-pillared response for newly self-employed, for creative, leisure and hospitality, a hardship fund, and also the pivotal resilience enterprise fund. Those three additional funds was to try and address those that weren't able to receive funds via the grants proposal. We are going to be expanding, as I've announced last week, and we'll give further details later today also on the bed and breakfast for those that don't pay rates. So we've got a system for that. Those in multiple occupancies, which some of the people that you've identified there may be in a situation, they're businesses, but they're actually sharing premises, and you might find that with some of the kind of the very smaller businesses, so they may be able to apply for that. On coaches, I'll say two things. One, we moved very swiftly at the beginning of lockdown to ensure that coach companies were not disadvantaged, particularly because of the closure of schools, because many coach companies had contracts with local authorities. And I particularly was very keen that we ensured that the initial cash flow problems for many businesses meant there was a requirement for the public sector to honour their commitments and to keep funding flowing through the system. And that is why coach companies were supported to continue to have the capacity for when schools returned. And there's another point in this, that we also know that because of not just in the education sector, but in other sectors as well, transport issues and distancing will mean that there'll be an increased reliance on coaches going forward. However, I think your point is there's probably a cash flow issue, particularly now because of the tourism downturn and the lack of demand there. So I'm very conscious of that. I know a number of coach companies have applied to the three-pillared additional funding to the grant system. I don't know whether all, from what you're saying, not necessarily all coach companies will have received funding through that. Some of those issues are whether they had residual cash flow support within their own company to get through the initial period of lockdown. But as we go forward, we're very conscious there will be some sectors that will not be restarting as soon as others, particularly around tourism, for example, and that puts pressure on coach companies. So I know Fergus Ewing is the Tourism Secretary and Michael Matheson as the Transport Secretary. I've got taken a keen interest in coaches, and we're looking to see what we can do if we can find additional funds to help support particular sectors that we need for our economy, because coaches are vital to the operation of much of our economy and will be in a different way going forward. I can't give you immediate answers as to what that will be, but I can give you my commitment that we are looking at the coach sector in particular.
Okay, Willie, do you want to come back?
Richard.
Oh, sorry, not Willie. Richard. Apologies. I've got you in my head, Willie, because you're next. Richard, sorry.
Thank you. That's okay, Convener. Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, thank you for that answer. I'm very pleased with that. But there are also reports that some councils are refusing applications but don't give a reason for refusal. So are you satisfied with how local authorities and the enterprise agencies have coped in terms of capacity and resources in getting the various funding mechanisms distributed? They have the money, you have certainly given councils the money, but are they getting it out quick enough?
I think the answer is yes, they are working as best they can. They have had to set up brand new systems that would probably have taken months previously have been set up in a matter of weeks. In terms of local authorities, that's a huge volume of activity. Again, we have to recognise, and I want to pay tribute to those that are administering these funds. They are working like many people from home. Many of them will have families themselves and are homeschooling. So these are individual council workers that are helping to administer these grants, and I want to pay tribute to what they have done. I would make the point that in looking at the figures on the applications, a number of businesses didn't apply right at the beginning. So it's actually a moving target in terms of the numbers that are applying week by week. Now, we may take a decision, as the Welsh have done, to look to close that phase of the grants, because that would allow us to identify if there was additional funds to put towards whether it's coach operators, etc. We're not in a position to do that just now because that fund is still open, but I think it's not unreasonable to do what the Welsh are doing and seek to bring that to a close so we can identify what resources there. So they have moved very rapidly. I do understand that there are different experiences from different councils. We know early on Glasgow had an IT issue, but that's been resolved. We can see the differences between different councils in terms of how they've managed to deliver. A lot of the delays have been because the applicants have not necessarily provided all the information that was required of them. So sometimes the delay has been actually going back to seek the information needed. Why is that important? This is public money. This is taxpayers' money. There is a real issue about potentially on fraud. And we can't allow that to come into the system because we need every single penny of this going to the right people. So in terms of delivery, they have managed to achieve what we asked them to do. On the enterprise area, I'll be able to update, I hope, with the additional information that I should receive at lunchtime and early afternoon in terms of the enterprise companies. But I would say also on the enterprise companies, and this might be something that you'd be interested generally, is the amount of co-working and cooperation and partnership between the agencies involved has actually been a blueprint about how we should expect them to work. I think it's been a criticism potentially in the past that our agencies perhaps don't work as lashly as they could. In terms of the Resilience Fund, the Hardship Fund and the newly Self-Employed Fund, that's involved partnership, yes, with local authorities, but primarily Highlands and Islands Enterprise, SOCIET and also Scottish Enterprise and Creative Scotland and Visit Scotland, and that's a good model. You asked the point about feedback and people not getting an explanation. I think the volume, particularly on the phase one of the grants to SMEs, the £10,000 grants and the £25,000 grants, that's been challenging. I think people, when they have appealed though, have gone back to the council, and I know as a constituency MSP, I've done that. Sometimes it's because the applicant hasn't provided all the information that they've needed. to do, and that's been some of the delay factors. But in terms of feedback, I would encourage councils to do that. I'm not sure whether they've got the bandwidth to do that in terms of the resource. On the second phase, which is the three-pillar phase of hardship, resilience and newly self-employed, certainly on the hardship resilience, I know Highlands and Islands and SOCHEP have been following up in terms of phone calls and explanations. That hadn't been happening with Scottish Enterprise, but they will now be explaining what the criteria is, so it will be easily identifiable to applicants as to why they haven't received funds. Some of it, it must be challenging to those that have managed to achieve sufficient cash flow within their business to get through this period. But because it's hardship, it genuinely is about hardship, and so therefore that might feel unfair or be an issue for companies. But we're trying to find a way that Scottish Enterprise also will provide feedback and also make sure that people are aware of the appeals mechanism as well. But we're very conscious, and that's been very conscious of the issue, and it's been very helpful to hear from MSPs and obviously their constituents to know what needs to be done to improve the system. So is it perfect? No, no system that could be established so quickly to affect so many people could be done as perfectly as we would want to. And we have tacked and changed our plans as others have as well.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And I'm going to move to Willie Coffey next. But Cabinet Secretary, I know it's very difficult with such a lot to say, but if we can try and keep the answers fairly succinct, otherwise we're going to struggle to get through everybody. Okay, thank you. So Willie Coffey, please.
Right, thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. In your letter to the committee, you talked about the reset phase, and you mentioned the response, reset, restart and recovery in your opening remarks. But in the reset phase, you were talking about the need to think about identifying requirements for regional support in Scotland. Could you maybe give us a little flavour of how that's progressing and what sort of regional support measures are you considering?
Okay. So I suppose there's different sizes. Certainly in terms of the grant system and the response area, we were looking to ensure that there was geographical spread. That's why there was that grouping, that partnership between the agencies to make sure the Highlands and Islands and the south of Scotland specifically were receiving the support that they needed, and it wasn't all just centred in the bulk of where the population and businesses were. In terms of reset, it's also identifying are there particular weaknesses or areas that have been affected more deeply, quite clearly. Some areas in relation to seafood, for example, have seafood production because of the collapse in demand in those areas. And clearly some areas in terms of tourism. And again, at some point you might want to hear or contact the Tourism Secretary Fergus Ewing for those matters. And that affects particular areas. I think the south of Scotland and Highlands and Islands in particular. And there's also that kind of point about, okay, if we're resetting and we're planning for the future, are there parts of the economy and geographically that we need to think through? And some of the energy transition is clearly on a geographic basis as well. I would say this, and I think this is most serious, is not only do we have to look at the regional impacts of COVID, if we don't get, if the UK government does not achieve a deal with the EU in relation to Brexit, and we're careering towards a no-deal Brexit, we know from the no-deal planning we did previously that certain parts of the economy would be affected, and certainly certain regions will be affected, even worse than, for example, food and drink. So I'm really concerned that we would actually have a double impact in certain regions of the economy that rely on, say, food and drink, etc. But those two factors, depending on what happens over the next, and it's only a few weeks with the 1st of July deadline, as to whether there can be extension or not, and whether there's a possibility or threat of no deal. I think that's a very serious one to consider as well. So we're going to have to overlay both of those. We've also asked the Economic Advisory Group to look at our regional focus as well, and we expect that to be part of their response.
Okay. Are there any figures to estimate that kind of impact at the moment if there was a no-deal Brexit scenario, particularly on the regional parts of Scotland that you mentioned there?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to ask Gary Gilespie, the Chief Economist, to come in on this as well. But clearly in relation to the COVID aspects, We've looked at a sectoral basis, and clearly some sectors, some parts of the geographical parts of Scotland are more reliant on some sectors than others. And that's why we've got to factor that in. But in relation to some of the impacts on Brexit, we did some previous no deal planning. I do think that's going to be something that we will have to come back to. And I think Mike Russell will also be explaining some of this in his statement tomorrow as well. But Convener, with your permission, I'd like to bring Gary Gilespie, our Chief Economist, in to give a perspective on what information we have in both the COVID impact, but also a potential Brexit impact on a no-deal Brexit.
Absolutely. Gary Gilespie, do you want to come in? You need to put your microphone on. That's it.
Okay,
that's it. Now you're on.
Convener. Thank you. So just in response to the point around Brexit, obviously COVID-19 has had a major impact in the economy, and we've done some internal modelling around the impact in terms of the shape of the recovery. So we know that the UK will formally end the transition period as planned on the 1st of January 2021, and the question around whether a further extension is granted. I think our modelling suggests that essentially a 1st of January exit would bring additional frictions to the economy. And what I mean by frictions is additional either cost to trade or cost to regulation in relation to whatever agreements are made. And that could essentially cost up to 1 to 2% of GDP. So that would be over and above the type of shape of recovery that we will face from the pandemic and the uncertainties around a W-shaped recovery and related issues. So that's some of the illustrative modelling, but I'll stop at that if that's okay.
Okay. Fiona, did you want to add anything, or have you finished on that one?
I just think it's the combination of those two factors, and particularly a no deal Brexit, if that's what transpires, would really compound what will already be a difficult situation, a very difficult situation with COVID. And so, regardless of what your views are on Brexit generally, I think there is concern about a no deal Brexit having further impact as well. I think the other point, which I'm not sure we've relayed to you, is in terms of, we probably have it, I think Gary will have done in other information, is that if you look at the financial crash, our understanding is that there was a 5% reduction in GDP over the first sort of 4 quarters of that crisis. But the severity of this one in terms of COVID, we've seen we anticipate it's a 33% reduction in GDP actually across the UK during the period of closure. So the shape of this is quite different. And so Gary Gilespie referred to what could be the type of response. At one point, there was analysis that thought this would be a sharp V-shaped dip, and then demand would come back. I think the issue we're facing just now is not just a reduction in local demand, but also global demand. And so there's a possibility that with restructuring and different changes, it's more likely to be a W-shaped recovery. But the timing of that compared to the dates that we're dealing with in terms of the calendar of potential Brexit is something that not only the Scottish government, obviously the UK government will have to factor in terms of their responses. But that's our Scottish government's position is quite clear that we need an extension precisely because whatever your views were on the Brexit timetable previously, when you're having to deal with a COVID crisis on top of this, that brings very big challenges indeed.
Okay, Willie, have you completed?
That's fine, Convener. Thanks very much, and other colleagues could come in now. Thanks.
Okay. In that case, I'll move to Alison Harris, please. Alison.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I would like to ask you about sector reopening guidance. There's a lot of confusion and anxiety amongst businesses that don't fit neatly into any particular sector, or they sit across more than one sector. So what guidance should those businesses follow? Also, how will the sector guidance be monitored and who's going to enforce this? And finally, Cabinet Secretary, businesses have also called for the Scottish Government to be much more transparent in the development of this sector guidance. So could I ask what your views are on that, please?
Okay. So there are three questions. On that last point, I think it was the CBI that said that, and actually when I explained that this was not about restart and how businesses and sectors were going to come back, but was actually about what makes workplaces safe. And there was extensive business involvement. We know Diageo, for example, involved in the manufacturing one. We've got major companies like Balfour Beatty involved in the construction sector, as well as sector leads. So they were reassured that obviously that workplace guidance had heavy business involvement, as it would need to. And what I do want to ensure that the business organisations are involved in is the advice on how to come back profitably, because you can physically make workplaces safe, you can use guidance, however challenging that might be, but the margins of operation and how you can do this and still keep your company and business going, as you're moving out of the furlough, the very welcome job retention scheme and the restart flexibility, which we'd actually asked for to allow companies that wanted to gradually come back, and how we did that. So that's what I'm specifically asking business organisations to help provide advice on. On the point about sector by sector guidance, there's a number of things here. The UK government produced types of workplace guidance, which was helpful. I mean, but it wasn't enough. We need to have sector by sector guidance. Indeed, the UK government are now doing that. I've been suggesting this for weeks, and I'm pleased to see that they're embracing that provision as well. Why is that important? Because if it's put together by businesses and trade unions, you will get confidence for staff to go back and customers to return to businesses. If there's specific issues around specific sectors and where they should go, the other aspects that we have is what I'm calling the advice, monitoring and enforcement pillar, which you asked about. Within that, there are references, and we have what employers should know, and we have advice contact lines that will help employers know which guidance they should be using. And again, if you look on the Scottish Government's website and the Find Business Support, you'll be able to find the links there. In relation to the monitoring and enforcement, HSE have been quite clear that they want to be able to enforce the issues around health and safety using their existing legislation. They've produced a joint statement of how they're going to operate, along with the environmental standards of local authorities and also the police and also ourselves. That joint statement was published last week. But there's also, I think, the important thing, and I suspect where your question is looking at, is the advice that businesses would need to which type of guidance to use. But again, this will have to evolve. We will have to we're required to revise the guidance every 3 weeks. I know even on the retail guidance, there's working, continuing to see if we can improve that. And that's where perhaps if we can identify some of those that are perhaps not easily fitting into one type, we can make sure that on the improvements, on the continuous improvements we'll be making to this guidance, we can capture those companies that you referred to.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. Now, last week, the committee heard from the advisory group on economic recovery. Both the Fraser of Allender Institute and the Scottish Chambers of Commerce had concerns about this group being yet another advisory group producing high-level statements of direction, but lacking the responsibility to provide specific practical recommendations. Evidence from the group seemed to confirm that this would be the case. So could I ask you, Cabinet Secretary, what's your view on that?
Well, I would give them the credit of waiting to see the report before you criticise them. I believe that we should work with experts. I do think also the remit that we gave the advisory committee was quite specific, that they had to look at regional responses, but also sectoral areas, and also looking at the advice for recovery in specific areas. So I'm expecting to have specific recommendations within that report. But remember, advisors advise and ministers decide. They've taken extensive research papers and suggestions from a wide range of people. I understand they've had 270 responses as well. I think the input that we've already seen, I read the Retail Consortium's input to the advisory group just last night, and there are specific asks and suggestions and practical suggestions. So I think by convening the advisory group, they are being able to help convene the intelligence in Scotland, the business experience. Lord Smith is engaging extensively with business organisations, but also in relation to the aspects about the sustainable economy, biodiversity and the green recovery. that's going to be in there as well. And my point again on well-being. So I think they will be extensive. I do think we need to have an understanding of the principles of what we want to operate. So there's nothing wrong with advising on principles, because that allows the country then to gather around that and implement them. But there is no monopoly on ideas. Absolutely not. This is going to take everybody putting their shoulders to the wheel. This committee as well has its responsibilities, and I'm sure that there's plenty of insight and ideas that will come from the committee as well. So let's be generous in our criticism, and ensure that we have a culture where everybody can be involved. And I'm looking forward to talking to the Fraser of Allender. I think it's tomorrow morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you, convener. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Can I move to Colin Beattie now? Hopefully Colin is with us. If you could turn Colin's mic on for him, please. Colin.
Thank you, convener. Cabinet Secretary, the COVID-19 crisis is obviously having a huge implication on public finances, hitting it with decreased tax revenues and both increased welfare spending and government borrowing. What are the implications that this has for the fiscal framework?
This is very serious indeed. It's more in the territory of Kate Forbes, the Finance Secretary, in terms of the analysis of what the implications will be for our taxation framework in relation to the resources that we'll have either from the UK government or indeed ourselves. I think it's quite clear that the arrangements we currently have can't really bear the weight of a crisis like this, like COVID, and potentially not in relation to what's coming down the track in relation to Brexit as well. The opportunities for governments to use borrowing at this point in time is extensive. It's not just the UK government who are borrowing to fund the very welcome job retention scheme. Countries across the globe are doing that in terms of particularly the low interest rates just now makes it an easier proposition. But that's really challenging for the Scottish Government when we're very restricted in terms of what we can do in relation to borrowing, and also that sort of it severely limits our room to manoeuvre in the recovery phase in particular, and that's where there has to be really active engagement to try and provide some changes in this. Independent states the world over can make decisions and use all the macro, all the fiscal elements. I'm not necessarily trying to make a constitutional point here. It's just to say that the limits of devolution means there are limits to what we can do. And I think it's probably in the interest of the UK government as well as the Scottish government to revise the opportunities for more flexibility within the fiscal framework, within devolution, if they want devolution to work. But certainly I know that you'll be hearing further from the Finance Secretary, and that is an area that I think will be helpful to you. So unless there's any further questions on that, I should have said at the beginning that if Gary Gillespie's got any views that for the economy and for the Economy Committee on the operation of the fiscal framework currently, and the limits it puts on us in terms of our operation, that might be helpful. But I'm also conscious, convener, if I wanted to bring him in, I was to bring him in at the beginning of my answer. But hopefully that's given broadcasters an opportunity to locate Gary.
Gary, do you want to come in and add something to that?
I'll be very brief if you want, convener.
Yeah, off you go.
Okay, so just to say, in the context of the fiscal framework, it was designed for a system in which essentially you picked up the relative performance in the economy between Scotland and the UK, and there was additional powers or latitudes for borrowing where growth rates differed a little bit. The scale of what we're facing at the moment, with during the lockdown period, the economy essentially nearly a third of output not being active, and the differences across different parts of the UK mean that it needs to adjust and be more flexible. And there's probably the greater scope for how it interacts with borrowing powers, and actually some of the treatments of public bodies in Scotland which score against the Scottish Government. So with a little bit of flexibility, there could be a greater leverage and devolution of powers to the Scottish Government, which would help support investment across different aspects of the economy. One final point, though, it's worth noting that UK fiscal framework is part of the UK wider borrowing, and we've seen in their April figures for borrowing a record month in terms of UK borrowing over 60 billion, which was equivalent to the whole of 2019-20 borrowing, and the debt to GDP ratio approaching nearly 100%. So the reason I mention these is that they shouldn't curtail the fiscal framework flexibility, but the management of the debt over the longer term will need to be done in a different way from the previous financial crisis. But I'll stop there, Convener. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Colin, did you want to come back in?
Yes, just to touch the cabinet.
Your microphone's gone off. Hold on. Right. Can you just check your microphone?
Can you hear me?
Right, you're back on. Off you go.
Good.
No, you've gone off again. Hold on. Hang on, Colin. Broadcasting, can we make sure Colin Beattie's microphone is on, please? Right, try again, Colin.
Okay, just...
Colin, I'm going to stop you again. For some reason, every time you speak, your mute goes on. Are you leaning on your computer?
I don't have a mute button on my computer, actually, for some reason.
Right. Okay, right, try again. You're back.
Just to pick up on something the Cabinet Secretary referred to earlier on.
Yeah, I'm afraid, Colin, we've lost you again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Dean Lockhart, who wanted to ask a supplementary, and perhaps broadcasting can try and sort Colin out in the meantime. So can we go to Dean Lockhart, please? Dean.
Thank you, Convener. Hopefully my microphone will be more successful. And good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I would like to follow up on the question about public finances. Recent figures show that the UK government has spent more than £10 billion in COVID support for Scotland, including the most generous job retention scheme in the world, which you mentioned earlier. However, I know that you have called for even more spending from the UK government. But the UK government, like any other government, as you know, has to balance and make a careful analysis between how much economic support the country needs and weigh that against how much borrowing is sustainable given the huge amounts of borrowing required. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, has the Scottish Government done a similar analysis of how much the Scottish Government would have been able to spend on the COVID crisis, assuming full fiscal autonomy here in Scotland, especially bearing in mind the fact that the fiscal deficit in Scotland before the COVID crisis was 7% of GDP, which was one of the highest in Europe?
So in relation to the COVID crisis, so you got me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fine. So in relation to the COVID crisis, as I set out, every single country in the world is having to respond to this, and they are responding in similar ways. For example, the job retention or wage subsidy was something that many other countries had already implemented as part of their response, and I specifically, prior to any announcement by the UK government, in my conversations with the UK government, was suggesting to them that it was really important that we had some kind of wage subsidy in response, and the job retention scheme has been very welcome, and as you set out, is one of the strongest across the globe. We've also asked for improvements in that. There's nothing wrong with that, flexibility to help people gradually restart. I think the margins of that could be really challenging for some sectors. So have we asked the UK government for more support in particular areas? Actually, yes, because there are particular aspects of the Scottish economy that will require longer term support, and two sectors in particular, the tourism sector, because we know that even if they can get back and have a summer season, their margins will be really challenging, and we need to keep that capacity because it's a really important part of our of our economy. We're part of the UK. Some of us have different views as to whether we would want to be part of the UK or not. I believe in independence for Scotland, but as of now, I'm not taking this as a political challenge. I'm not spending time on addressing political arguments, Dean, because I don't think the Scottish people will thank us for us. We should be spending all our time and effort not doing retrospective analysis of what we could have done when. They want to know here and now how we're supporting them. And I'm not going to be drawn into your constitutional debate on this precisely because my job, my responsibility is to ensure that we can, as of now, support people under the provisions that we have because that's what they expect of us. And I am working cooperatively with the UK government and I intend to continue. But I do think that in the request for the UK government looking at Scotland's specific interests, oil and gas is another area, not just affected by COVID, but clearly issues around the price of oil really causing difficulties in that area, that we should be looking at whether we can continue some kind of wage subsidy support for those sectors. Why is that important in terms of oil and gas? Well, it's the energy transition, and we know the supply chains that are so crucial in that sector are really important in terms of capacity to keep us and to have those skills for when we have that energy transition. So in terms of resources, you talked about 10 billion, but that's what states can do when they've got the powers and the leverage to borrow on the markets. And that's what other countries have done as well. You've just heard from the Chief Economist the level of the UK borrowing, that borrowing to help support very welcome interventions, and I appreciate the job retention scheme, how important it is. That borrowing was equivalent in 1 month, and that was the equivalent of a whole year last year. So the whole dynamic of not just either devolved or national, but global markets in relation to borrowing have completely changed. But as of now, I think we need to focus on the here and now and what we can deliver, and that's what my responsibility as Economy Secretary is, and that's what I'll continue to do.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I wasn't making a political point. It's more a financial question and an economic question, because you said earlier there has been some modelling done on the potential impact of Brexit in different scenarios. So my question was similar to that type of modelling. Has there been any modelling done in terms of what level of funding and what level of support the Scottish Government could have delivered to the Scottish economy on a standalone fiscal basis? And it sounds like if the answer is that work hasn't been done, then that's fine.
It's not a priority for us to do. As at this moment, we'll be very similar to other countries, for example, like Denmark or Finland. And Ireland for that matter. But the point about the immediacy of the issue, my concern particularly is the threat of a no deal will also have major impacts, and not so much the threat of it. We'll know very soon whether there's a potential that it could be if there's no extension provided, and if there can't be agreement made. And so therefore we've got to deal with the here and now, and it's the here and now that we're working on in terms of financial modelling.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, could I just ask a question based on that discussion you've just had? Because you started this, and I think Gary Gilespie indicated that actually this is about feeding into the discussion next how it might operate, and that had we had borrowing powers, that would have enabled us to respond to this crisis. So in terms of looking at our response and looking at what Scotland is doing, a simple question really. Are you both suggesting that had we had borrowing powers within the fiscal framework, we would have borrowed above and beyond the 3.7 billion that's come directly from the UK Barnett consequentials, and on top of the job retention scheme that is obviously paid directly by the UK government to Scottish employers at the moment? So are you talking about using additional borrowing, or are you talking about looking for a change so that Scotland would independently have borrowed all that money? I'm just sort of slightly confused as to what you're both sort of stating, whether it's additional or instead of.
Well, I think that's what Dean's. I'm going to say this was. I didn't bring this into the conversation. It was Dean Lockhart. You could do it in different models. Clearly, borrowing as an independent state, as the UK has done, is one level of type of borrowing, and the support you can have for your economy using those powers.
Can I just intervene? This is not about whether Scotland is dependent. This is about changing the fiscal framework or feeding into the fiscal framework as a result of this crisis.
Yes.
As to
Yeah,
we need borrowing, borrow in addition or instead of.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Convener, but there's a bit of a break-up in the sound I'm hearing from you just now. So I'll try and address your point specifically in terms of the fiscal framework. So the fiscal framework needs revised. I think there's a reasonable consensus around that. In relation to what we would do with it, I'm very conscious that there was the immediate response. We can make a judgment whether we would have wanted to borrow more on the response stage. I think in my earlier comments, I indicated that actually the strength of borrowing would be for future growth and recovery, because a lot of that support will be into growth sectors and areas, for example, in relation to energy transition, which is about economic recovery, not just coping with the current situation that we're in. But those flexibilities allow you choices to what for what you can do, whether it's in kind of dealing with immediate responses in terms of grants. We've obviously worked very hard to deliver the grants system that we have just now, but I particularly think that borrowing is helpful for that future foundations for economic growth, with support for companies and growth companies. And that's the challenge we're going to have going forward, is how do we manage in a revised budget situation to identify the funding that we can have to support businesses where we might want to do some kind of investment and development, particularly in the energy transition area, in new starts, for example, and also in relation to some of the tech companies. So to give you a practical example, in looking at some of the new start companies, the UK government have put together a futures fund, which is very welcome. Again, I'd called for it way back at the beginning of lockdown because we knew that would be a challenge. They've identified £250 million from the UK, which is to be match funded in terms of support for new start companies. But it requires every company that's applying for that to have had £250,000 investment from the private sector sources prior to application. Now that limits, and it's not just me saying it, Wales and Northern Ireland have got concerns as well, that on the scale that it's operating at is limiting involvement for companies that are based by and large in London or around the kind of the southeast sector. What we need is some flexibility there to allow us choices to be made to how we support new start companies, and some of that will be about using borrowing powers to enable funding for us to be able to support economic growth and restart. There's also borrowing in relation to how you support your basic services, which is obviously again another borrowing factor in terms of the fiscal framework that might be needed for some of our public finances areas, depending on the choices that we make going forward. So it all comes back to the choices you want to make of where you want to put your resources. As Economy Secretary, I'm very keen on ensuring that we've got enough resources to help us in relation to our economic activity. But if you talk to the Finance Secretary, she'll be taking probably a more overarching view as to the flexibility we need in order to help some of the ongoing issues. So, for example, our universities are devolved, our heritage is devolved. Currently, I'm wrestling also with how do we support, as long as they make sure they're not making half of their staff redundant in the National Trust for Scotland, or indeed Historic Environment Scotland. So the idea of using endowments to help support those areas where we know they've got a long-term future, we know that demand will come back at some point, but they've got immediate crisis. How can we support them? We've tried to use endowment models, for example, Abbotsford House, which some of you will be familiar with. That was a model that was used in that area where, again, it was about a provision of resource that was backed by lending from the Scottish Government in a direct way. But there's a difference between borrowing for specific projects when the Scottish Government have the resource, but also borrowing to underpin your economy and your society in terms of the wider fiscal framework. And the flexibility of the latter will help us in practical steps with the former. And I've maybe given you some examples of where the capacity to have more borrowing powers themselves will allow governments to themselves think about how they might want to use the resources.
Thank you for that. I see we've got Colin back again, so we'll try and go back to Colin Beattie so that he can finish what he was trying to say, and hopefully his mic will stay open now. So, Colin, are you there?
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I missed a wee bit of the conversation there, so if I'm repeating something, my apologies. But recently, you said in Parliament that the time of a well-being economy has well and truly arrived. What specific policies are you thinking to introduce to move Scotland towards a well-being economy?
Okay. Well, Scotland was one of the governments that first established the Wellbeing Economy Governance Group, and I will ask Guy Gilespie to give you an update on the contacts we've had with the other governments during the lockdown period. But it means that we're moving, instead of measuring what is successful simply on GDP measures, for example, especially when you look at the collapse in GDP over 33%, in terms of that relative measures of success. I think there's a different perspective now because of the COVID experience on how useful GDP is a measure of what you're trying to achieve. It means moving to a more values-based view as what we want from as a society. It means more inclusive growth. Now, we know that you cannot improve your economy if you can't take everybody with you as part of that inclusive growth agenda, because the disparities of inequalities actually undermine what you're trying to achieve in the economy space. And that's going to be really challenging, especially when you've got more youth employment or female employment in particular. That's one of the things we have to face immediately. But it also means that you're looking at how you can develop measures of improvement in relation to a net zero economy. You know that in terms of our challenges, our climate change plan was due to be produced. It's having to be delayed. It doesn't necessarily mean that the actions are delayed. If anything, I'm very keen as the Economy Secretary that they're brought forward. But it's a different type of society. And so we've been working particularly with Iceland and New Zealand, but also there are other countries starting to be involved. And indeed, Finland, when the presidency of the EU took part in a session the Scottish Government convened in Scotland House in Brussels, looking at their interests in relation to wellbeing economy. But if I can maybe bring in, with your permission, Convener, if I can bring in Guy Gilespie to talk about the more recent contact that has been taking place between the Scottish Government and the other wellbeing governments who are also facing similar challenges of COVID that we are.
Guy Gilespie.
Okay, thank you very much, Convener. So I think, as the Cabinet Secretary has indicated, we had a meeting with the Government of Iceland, New Zealand, Finland, Wales on the 28th of April, and we also had expert input from the OECD and Martine Duran from the Council of Economic Advisors. It's worth just saying, so the Wellbeing Economy Initiative really is looking at economic wellbeing, societal wellbeing and environmental wellbeing, and how you bring those together. And the OECD have led a lot of the initial work around the Better Lives Index and the framework for how you assess the overall performance of an economy. At the meeting at the end of April, we discussed three things really: the response to the pandemic, the immediate response across the economic, social and environmental landscape, and how the countries were thinking about that immediate response would feed into a more sustainable wellbeing type future. And I should have mentioned Wales were on the call as well. And really, each country has a performance framework. That Scotland has the National Performance Framework, and New Zealand have Better Life Index, Wales have Future Generations, Iceland have a wellbeing framework. And it's really understanding how the interaction of wellbeing and the pandemic impact on the economy. And what was really interesting was there was a consensus in approach that it was a health crisis first and foremost, but we had to look carefully at what was happening below that, both in terms of the economic sustainability, but also the societal impacts and also the environmental impacts, which remain an ever-present. I think the key messages that came out of it was really this: there is a real opportunity now to accelerate some trends in the economy, to look at things that maybe we couldn't have tackled as strongly, as quickly. We're seeing trends moving in terms of transport modes, how people work, operate. We're seeing certain aspects of social capital increasing, trust in government, community wellbeing. So there's a real opportunity to rethink how we do and operate the economy on that basis. Finally, I know we're not got much time. We've also a meeting scheduled again in the next couple of weeks to look at how we're restarting the economies and how we're building in that longer term vision as part of that. And finally, we get a lot of interest from different countries around the world asking about what practical steps they can take. And one of the first practical steps is obviously to have a framework that's broad enough to encapsulate the 3 different types of wellbeing, and a framework for how to measure and translate that. And the final point I would say is we're learning a lot from New Zealand around how they prioritise wellbeing and bring it into their budget application and bring in evidence to manage the trade-offs that are involved. But I'll stop there, Convener. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Colin, did you want to come back, or?
I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, right. Dean, you were next. I think you've got one question that you haven't asked yet.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. It's in relation to the enterprise budget, because Cabinet Secretary, as you know, countries across the world are reallocating their budgets as a result of the COVID crisis. In relation to the enterprise budget here in Scotland, which is approximately £500 million if you add in the budget for the Scottish National Investment Bank and financial transactions money from the UK Treasury, how is this budget being reallocated to deal with the COVID crisis? And in particular, how much of the £500 million enterprise budget has been allocated to help existing business get through the crisis?
Okay. Thank you very much, Dean, for that question. We issued a revised interim letter of guidance in April because clearly with the COVID crisis, we had to alert all the enterprise agencies that they would need to pivot and to identify and reorganise to help support that crisis. So you've seen the initial establishment of the Fine Business Support, the website, the phone support, and the additional information support and advice, and there's been quite extensive advice in that area. But also in terms of looking at what that budget can buy. Now, there's obviously commitments in growth areas that they had, which would still be important. In fact, if anything, more important, because we have to ensure that we've got the growth sectors developing. I think it's fair to say that originally they thought that companies would cancel plans because of COVID. That hasn't happened necessarily to the extent that they thought. So one of the things I've asked them to do, I think your point is very well made, is to assess looking forward how much of that can be repurposed for other uses and how much we need to continue in what area. And also you mentioned the Scottish National Investment Bank, which will become even more important with a mission-based approach and trying to use the financial transactions within that. So where we are just now is trying to assess where companies are that can continue to develop, but a lot of Scottish enterprise time will be on focusing support for companies that are potentially in a difficult situation. They've always done that in the past, but I think we've got to have a reality check that even with the best will in the world, not all companies are going to be able to survive. And so therefore we've got to help those that we can and to help support those workers from companies that are being made redundant and to reposition them. So there really is a shift and pivot and change in how the enterprise companies are servicing businesses and supporting them. But in terms of reallocation of funding, that's something that we're assessing as to what we can be released for different areas. But I don't think it would be wise to renege on commitments that have been made for growth sectors, because we might need they will be the companies that will have the jobs for the future. And if we're facing large scale unemployment, particularly with young people, then we need to make sure that we've got growth companies for the future. So it's a very important question. I can't give you a definitive answer, but it gives you a sense of what we're trying to do with that priority.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Just a follow-up question on the theme of recapitalisation, because as you know, the UK Treasury is embarking on a massive recapitalisation programme, Project Birch, which will see billions of pounds coming in the form of equity and debt investment to businesses across the UK. What steps the Scottish Government taking to identify those companies in Scotland that are critical to the economy, but which might not survive because of COVID?
We're actively looking at that. That's a real priority that the enterprise companies have. Indeed, I was involved in a meeting just yesterday and looking at the mechanisms and the systems by which we can help monitor, track, have intelligence in those companies that would need support from recapitalisation and equity. Stakes, for example, is something the UK government has not taken off the table. Indeed, there's hints that they may look at those areas. I have a regular call with BEIS, Mrs. Zahawi, on a weekly basis, and also with the Chancellor on the Economy and Business Group. I know the initial focus has been on the response. We are now focused on recovery. Some of the larger companies in the Scottish economy that they are looking at, we are also working with them and have that kind of official to official contact in relation to some of the kind of key companies in Scotland's economy that are obviously threatened is a strong word, but really vulnerable. You're quite aware of aviation issues, aerospace issues are significant. There's also areas in other parts of the UK, particularly as well in steel, where I know that there's individual companies are being looked at very carefully by the UK government. We're liaising with them, and it's one of the things that in my very early calls with Mrs. Nadeem Zahawi, I asked if we could ensure that we kept close contacts in, because that will require recapitalisation. It's an area that I would like Scotland to be able to do more on, because again, it would help us in that growth agenda, as well as you say, trying to make sure that we can keep businesses in business when what they're actually looking for is an injection of equity in some shape or form. So that's a big agenda item for me. It's where, in terms of my attention, yes, I've been involved heavily along with Kate Forbes in the grants and the response area, but increasingly my attention will be on exactly the territory that Dean Lockhart has referred to.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Final question from me. In relation to the Scottish Advisory Group on economic recovery and their recommendations, when do you expect the recommendations to be available, and will they be publicly available when released?
Absolutely. We've got to be as transparent as possible. So we're expecting it to be published towards the end of June. I'm very keen, depending on the parliamentary timetable, that there is an open debate on the report when it's published. But obviously, we need to work at the timescale with the Parliamentary Business Bureau. But I think we need to be as open as possible to make sure that people can debate the report, say what they think about it, challenge it, but also if they have alternative ideas to reflect it. I also think that the ideas that will come through from all the extensive engagement that you'll have heard from the advisory group themselves that they are engaged in will also be helpful. So as well as obviously the advisory group, I myself I spend a lot of time talking to a lot of organisations and businesses and wider groups. I talked to Link, for example, Environmental Link, just the other day. I think there's a real interest in how we can capture some of that empowerment agenda in communities for change that I think they can facilitate as one of the ways that we need to develop as an economy going forward if we are truly to be a wellbeing economy. So I hope you can get your chance, Dean, to analyse it and also contribute. And you might want to speak to your business manager to see if we can make sure we can get a debate at some point.
That sounds good. Thank you very much.
Okay, can we move to Rhoda Grant now, please? Rhoda.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you talked about inclusive growth and the impact on the pandemic on young people and women, and indeed the low paid are also being badly affected. Can I ask if you have considered a job guarantee scheme, if you've looked at ways that the modern apprenticeship system can be adapted to meet these challenges, and indeed what your instructions to Skills Development Scotland are?
Okay, that's a hugely important area, and I'm very concerned about the impact on young people, and it will be immediate because there's obviously school leavers this year, and I know that the developing young workforce are very focused on that. First Minister announced last month that Nora Senior, who would leave the Enterprise and Skills Strategic Board, a subgroup of that she's going to chair, specifically looking at what we will need in terms of employability and skills support to address the points that Rhoda Grant has made. We know we will need to have something at scale, which will be a challenge. We know that there is a role in terms of retraining, reskilling with the colleges. There's always challenges with the modern apprenticeships at time of crisis. I know because I was directly involved as a minister at the time of the financial crisis. We moved from having 10,000 apprenticeships from what we inherited from the previous Scottish Executive to 30. The more certainly moved at that time up to about 25,000, and it got even further. Supporting young people in employment is critical. So therefore, it's something that ensures that they don't slip out of either education, employment or training in terms of that guarantee support is something that we will need to look at as to what's feasible to make sure that they've got longer term support. What I am concerned about is something that is just short term. So I think the apprenticeship model is a strong one. We certainly, at the time of the financial crash, looked at how we supported those apprenticeships and those apprentices that were, say, for example, in manufacturing companies that close, and could they be taken on by anybody else? And we developed at that time the Adopt an Apprentice scheme, which I think maybe we need to bring back, or I think it's not gone away, but there's been less demand for it, to ensure that people can complete their apprenticeships if they're part way through. So these are all areas that Skills Development Scotland, when they get the report and the recommendations from Nora Senior, will certainly enact on it. It's an area that, again, looking at the financial provisions that we have, there currently is little headroom to do additional work at this stage. That's something we're going to have to look very carefully at. We do have £33 million from the Fair Start Scotland support. Now, it again will have to be pivoted to ensure that it can support the demands that COVID will bring to it. But I'm going to be working with John Swinney and Jamie Hepburn, who's the Business and Skills Minister in particular, will take a lead on this to make sure that Skills Development Scotland reorganise what they're doing. There'll be some of the Skills Development Scotland's programmes that will not be appropriate at this time, and there'll be less demand for them. So again, it'll be a case of how can we use their existing budget and change it to help meet the needs of young people in particular. Now, we focused on that previously after the financial crash. As I said, this will be a completely different scale than we had seen during the financial crash and the crisis thereafter. And we managed to move Scotland from having a lot of challenge in youth employment to be in a position that they had the lowest youth unemployment in all of Europe, and so therefore we have to have that dedication. Rhoda Grant will remember, as I did in the 1980s, when there was the degree of unemployment of a scale which we might get to during this result. If we get to 10% unemployment, the impact for young people, I think, will be absolutely devastating. So therefore, I think the responsibility in all of us to respond to that, with those growth companies I talked about, with those companies that are still being able to deliver and deliver well, to ensure and support them to take on young people. But we can't guarantee jobs if the jobs aren't there. We need to support the companies to have the jobs and to expand the provision, particularly for young people. And there'll need to be a bit of a national mission on this and national support to make sure that we don't have a lost generation that we've previously seen in this country. So I can give you my commitment and my government's commitment. We see this as a priority. And Convener, I do think that the labour market and issues around skills will be increasingly up the agenda, and I'm sure the committee will want to give more attention to that as well.
Rhoda, you want to come back?
Yes, can I come back? Cabinet Secretary mentioned back to the 1980s, and one of the systems in place in the 1980s was community projects where people were guaranteed a job at a fair pay, and they were doing work that was good for the community. And I see that there's the chance of maybe doing some environmental work, which I think we could do. People are talking about increasing things like walking paths and cycling paths, and that seems to lend itself to a degree. Also, the companies that were growth industries prior to the pandemic may not be the growth industries post-pandemic, because I think we've seen a big shift. And we also had evidence last week about educational maintenance allowances to keep people who are in school and university in the education system for a little while longer while the recovery happens. I'm wondering if all those things are things you have considered.
Yes, indeed. On that latter point, I mean, I've been a big supporter of the Educational Maintenance Allowance, and 10 years ago, there was a bit of pressure as to whether we should maintain that. You'll know in England they removed the educational maintenance allowance, but I think it was a very important tool to help young people from families that were financially disadvantaged to stay at that time, even if it was kept them in for a couple of years. And that's why obviously you currently have seen the high levels of young people that stay in education into 6 years. Well, now, I think it's a real challenge if you're a young person and you're going into 6 year with a blended model. What does that look like? Because that's different from a full-time education as you would have got 10 years ago if you stayed at school supported by the educational maintenance allowance. I think there's a big role there for colleges, and as there has been in the past, I think they're going to be absolutely key in how we support young people, particularly those of the age that you're talking about, which are potential school leavers. Your point about community projects, I think, is very well made. If we're moving, particularly for a green recovery, and that isn't just going to be in terms of large companies, in terms of energy transition. There's so much we can do in our environment to help that green recovery and actually deliver our climate change and biodiversity targets. So in relation to what that will look like, I'm very interested in the New Zealand model of looking at that wellbeing approach of 4 capitals. You know, you've got financial capital, you've got natural capital, human capital, and social capital, and bringing those together, you can see something that would be very effective to meet what our targets of inclusive and sustainable net zero projects could look like. At the same time, I think there's a responsibility again to look at renewables and also digital rollout, and whether there can be sort of training schemes and support mechanisms put in place that those companies that are in the energy market in particular can take on far larger numbers of young people than previously. So there's a lot in that, and there's a lot of things that we can do, but I think something that is community based would be a very strong and powerful one. The one thing I think we've all recognised is the strength of our local communities and how they've responded socially to helping people in health crisis. We now need the same approach, but on an economic point, and I think that's potentially where Rhoda Grant has, the suggestions and reflections of what has worked in the past and whether we can think about those again.
Okay. Rhoda, have you got anything else, Rhoda? Are you finished?
That's fine, thank you.
Right, we'll go to Gordon MacDonald then, please. Gordon?
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, social distancing has had a huge impact across our economy, from public transport to retail and tourism, all important sectors for Edinburgh. The policy was brought in to protect lives. Could you say a bit more about how the Scottish Government plans to restart the economy and at the same time try to avoid a second peak in the virus?
That clearly is the key question of how we deal with that, and I want to be quite blunt. If phase 1, and that means people's personal behaviour, their behaviour in their travel, and the contacts they have and how they go about their activities, if phase 1 is not successful, then it will not help our economy. Our economy and our restart is absolutely dependent on everybody abiding by the rules in relation to the phase 1 in terms of physical distancing, and that means travel in particular. We know there are pressures, particularly on our tourism sector, and we want to be able to return, but if we see scenes as we've seen in some of the tourist spots in Scotland over the last few days, and those individuals that are gathering in large groups, that are going to places that are clearly out with that 5 mile guidance recommendation in terms of travel, are not only jeopardising their own and their family's health, or indeed those of the people that are living in that communities, they're actually jeopardising the potential for our tourism industry to come back when they're ready. And I know that's quite harsh, but that's why the whole system approach that we've put together is underpinned by transport, childcare, education, people's movements. You've seen that one of the first phases is children's hearings, because we know vulnerable children need support, and so therefore that's a decision to come back. It's not just about how individual premises can be made safe and individual workplaces. It's what that implication of that company or that business opening up has for more travel and how that affects the transport system. And Michael Matheson, the Transport Secretary, has made quite clear to operate safely and for the safety of transport workers as well. In the guidance that he produced last week, there's going to have to be a limited amount of movement. And that's why home working is still the cornerstone of activity. And it's really important that people who can stay at home and work do stay home at work, and they're supported by their employers. But this is not going to be easy, and it's going to rely a lot on employers thinking through the personal individual circumstances of their staff. They'll need to support them when they're self-isolating, because that's going to be an issue. Childcare will be an issue in relation to when schools can work, because those that have children will have to have caring responsibilities, and there's also those that are living in shielding accommodation. So I'm sorry, Convener, that's quite a long answer, but it's a critical point, and I will just re-emphasise the economy needs phase one to work, and I would appeal to everybody and indeed MSPs to help support that message.
Last week, the committee heard from James Smith of the Resolution Foundation, who said after lockdown is lifted, they, the public, will not go to restaurants or do other things that involve social consumption in exactly the same way. He then went on to say the big risk is that support in key sectors is withdrawn too soon, or that we ask too much of firms in contributing to people's wages, which could lead to a big shakeout in those sectors and a lot of people becoming unemployed. What is your view about whether the UK government's job retention scheme should be extended beyond October?
I think there's a strong case for that for particular areas. Excuse me, Convener, I've got a frog in my throat.
Do you? Oh, yeah.
No, I'm fine. I just needed to get a drink there. Yeah, in terms of sport, I don't want to undervalue the job retention scheme. I think it's very valuable indeed, and I think the flexibility is a good thing for those companies that are able to restart, and the gradual and tapered way that it has been presented, I think, is helpful, but not for every business and not for every sector. And I talked earlier on about it's all well that you could do the configurations to reopen, and you can see that in pubs and restaurants looking in some of the earlier stages to work outside. I hope the weather stays and is good to them, but that's going to be a challenge, because we know that that's not going to be possible, and with our climate, that's going to be a challenge. So therefore, it's not just about being able to physically distance and provide that service. It's how do you do it in a way that keeps your business going, because you hear from some businesses saying, well, unless we've got a 70% occupancy or 70% turnover from previously, we will not be able to manage, and we'll have to make people redundant. And of course, what the UK government has done, as other governments have done with the wage subsidy of the job retention scheme, is realise it's cheaper for them to support that, however massive it is in terms of borrowing. And we've heard the figures earlier on from the Chief Economist. It's massive levels of borrowing to sustain that. The cost of having mass unemployment rather than that would be more expensive in the longer term. But I do think for those sectors, and those sectors in Scotland, for understandable public health reasons, because our position in the cycle of the pandemic is different from the rest of the UK, and we may recognise that that there are differences, and we have to accept that. But whether it's because of the timing of Scotland's phasing, or whether it's in relation to some of the sectors that are key, that there might have to be additional support beyond October in relation to some sectors. And I've written to the Chancellor specifically about the tourism and hospitality area, but I mentioned previously, I think those in the energy transition area will also require some additional support for the supply chain to continue. So, I could criticise and say it was wrong of them to have not announced that now, but to be fair to the Chancellor, originally the job retention scheme was to finish in a few weeks' time, and it's been extended. Originally, it was never going to be flexible, but now it's been made more flexible for those looking to restart. The problem will be for those that will take a longer time frame. So, if we've managed to persuade, as others have, the Chancellor to do what he has done in extending and changing the job retention scheme, I'm going to be persistent doing it on a sectoral basis. And I think if there was a cross-party support for that across the Scottish Parliament, that would help us in that case as well.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay. Can I move to Andy Whiteman now, please? Andy Whiteman.
Thanks very much, Convener. I just want to observe in response to questions earlier about borrowing, of course, that the UK government is selling gilts to the Bank of England to the tune of around £200 billion, which is being financed literally by printing money. So the power of having a central bank in a crisis is incredibly important. I wanted to ask Cabinet Secretary about the statement she made last week in the Chamber that we will need, and I quote, a revolution in economic thinking. And I'm wondering if she's in a position to say anything more about what that revolution might look like.
Well, the good things about revolution is they're never developed by one person individually. It's done on a collective basis, and I think that's what Scotland is having to face up to just now. Are we prepared to say, actually, measuring the world by the old-fashioned way of GDP, the traditional methods of global consumption and the way it's been, are those traditional ways the ways that we need going forward? And I think people know that life will never be the same again on a personal basis, but also in terms of how economies work. They're going to have to change, not just, I think, domestically here in Scotland, but internationally as well, how we finance things, how we value things. And I think going back to Rhoda Grant's point, the point about that community thinking and analysis is going to be part of that response stage. But in terms of the economy, it does mean being serious about having a well-being economy. And there are a few countries and a few governments in the world that are embracing that and have taken it forward, but it's always been in the shadows, and it's been something you always have to try and explain, and it seems as if it's peripheral. But I do think a well-being economic approach is a revolution thinking and something that we should embrace. But I also think that there are different models that can be out there and different ways of working. And in terms of perspective, my degree is economic history, so I always take the long view of these things. And there's always been adaptations and changes when there's been shocks to the system of the economies in the past. And I think the free market economy is under question just now in terms of how it can properly work. There's got to be a mixed market and a mixed market approach. And in terms of how we support each other, is the codependencies of people is really important. The fact that we can't, as a society, survive without the support of care services. We can't survive without reliance on the childcare and our education systems and how we value them. But we also have to generate income, and what does income look like, and what does value look like. So I think that kind of thinking, if we can get some kind of consensus in Scotland, we can work with those countries that are interested and try and do more with that going forward. And I know your interest particularly into changes in relation to energy and climate change. And they are not just worthy in and of themselves, they're also catalysts of how people can work and change a value system as well. And I think it's that type of thinking that will come to the fore, I'm sure, as part of the debates in recovery. But we have to move very swiftly from making decisions to actually show in practice. And I think that's going to be a challenge for all of us.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to hearing and discussing more about that. In order to advance such a revolution, though, you talked about interdependencies and the global challenges. There's going to have to be unprecedented cooperation economically between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. Now, we've already mentioned in passing challenges of the fiscal framework. Beyond the fiscal framework itself, what discussions are taking place between the Scottish and UK governments about the medium-term economic outlook and the kind of measures that are going to be required to build a resilient economy?
So in terms of cooperation, I mean, interdependencies are very important, and you see in terms of that happening in terms of the Nordic states working together. You see it in terms of other parts of the world where localised economies are working together. And there's always needs to be a global response as well. I'm not sure that global institutions have responded or indeed articulated any kind of vision or change, and that's the challenge for politicians and leaders to help shape that debate. In relation to working with the UK government, the cooperation and activity, however frustrating it can be in many shapes and forms, we've currently got an issue in relation to the £60 million of consequentials for business support additional to the original allocation and not being followed through. So we will have to pursue that. But we hope that these issues can be resolved, because a lot of this has to be done on trust as to when people say things are available, they follow through with that. Because, for example, in the point Rhoda Grant was making on employability and skills, I can't imagine the UK aren't going to have a major intervention in that area, and that will bring with it consequentials. But it's very difficult for us to plan now without knowing how much that might be. So having trusted and confidential, and I understand it's not our job, and I never have announced a UK government initiative, even if I've known about it, because it's for them to lead on that for their own, on their own announcements. But we kind of need to know so we can plan in terms of our fiscal responsibilities ourselves, in terms of how we can finance things. And employability and skills is a very big example where we would be able to plan much, much better if we knew if there were consequentials coming, or do we have to then take money from another part of the economy that can't afford it within devolution, and then subsequently find out there might be consequentials, and there's a bit of time wasting, but also productivity wasting in that level. So there's a lot of work takes place between the Kate Forbes and the Chief Secretary of the Treasury in particular. And I have my regular conversations with the Minister of Bees. What is happening at officials level is our Scottish Government officials so far have been working with UK officials in preparing the plans for recovery that will come to ministers. I specifically asked that on the weekly calls that we have, that we're presented with some of those recovery papers, so we can work with them and identify, okay, what can we do that supplements some of the UK state activities, and what can we do under devolution. So there's a lot of cooperation, and of course, from a media and a news point of view, you always hear about the disagreements. The bad news and disagreements make for better headlines than necessary cooperation. But I also know it's part of my job is to try and see if we can tease through what are challenging circumstances. Everybody's working at pace in both governments to identify how we can make the most of the situation that we're currently in, and to make sure we've got plans that can absolutely reflect the specific needs of Scotland's economy, but also tie into what the UK's government's doing, and try and as importantly, influence them in their thinking. I do think, and I've been told by UK ministers, that my contributions and suggestions have influenced some of their decisions, particularly in relation to some of the thinking around changes to the loan scheme that they had, because obviously at the start it was very blunt. The 100% guarantee, the bounce back loans, you've got banks that are delivering far more in loans in that scheme that came in later than the original ones, and expanding some of the loans to the larger companies, as well as some of the issues around sectoral guidance, different aspects. So, it's important that we do share thinking and we do share ideas. But in terms of recovery, I would like to see us a bit more advanced in the sharing of information and suggestions at ministerial level. I do have another meeting which will take place tomorrow. It's the regular quad call with Wales, Northern Ireland and the UK government, and we are shifting, I hope, now into the recovery planning and sharing of what the UK government are planning to do, and therefore we can then tailor what we're doing accordingly.
Okay, thank you. I mean, that was useful. I suppose I was looking for some insights more on the fundamental difference there is between the Scottish Government and the UK Government politically, and how in the medium to longer term they can work together in new ways. But we'll leave that there. I just had one final question which I wanted to ask, and time is short, so maybe you could respond either in writing or intimate to us that you're going to be responding via a statement or whatever. But the Test and Protect strategy will require support for those people who are isolating, and I'm aware that there's been good cooperation between employers, STUC and government in terms of fair work to date, but that's going to pose particular challenges because people are being asked to isolate when they have no symptoms whatsoever, and therefore arguably, for example, not eligible for sick pay. I just want some confirmation at this stage that you're across that and it could come forward with clear proposals on that, given that we're in the Test and Protect phase now.
Well, this was an issue even before we went into lockdown, because you remember at that stage people had to isolate themselves if they had symptoms, but obviously that's now extended, and Test and Protect will also make it a fundamental part of how we respond to suppressing the virus. There will also be other health issues. So even before the lockdown, I was preparing that statement that the STUC agreed. We want businesses to agree this as well. It makes sense that you support people who are either shielding or having to isolate. I've also raised this continuously with the UK government. The support for payment of statutory sick pay, which is their responsibility for SMEs, has been very welcomed indeed when people are self-isolating. I think something like that will have to continue, particularly for smaller companies, because that's critical, because this will work if people then take on the point of self-isolating. And on your point about political differences, well, who'd have thought the UK government would have been borrowing the level it has in terms of its activity? Who'd have thought they would have been responsible for one of the major wage subsidy projects that is taking place in the world? So I suspect that the UK government fundamentally has had to rethink how they operate. And if you actually examine where they were and where they are now, they have shifted a considerable amount. Whether they'll stay in that position in terms of recovery, I don't know. But that's obviously something for the future.
Thank you.
Okay, so I mean, recovery is obviously going to be the key to the economy, and whether businesses can get back to work, whether they can reignite their turnovers and their profitability. One of the things that's going to really hit that potentially is the cost of meeting the HSE guidelines for reopening, particularly where there's materials to be purchased, where there is social distancing to be put in place. Do you have, or have you done any work on the potential impact to businesses? We're going to require a completely different kind of support to enable businesses to reopen under the guidelines?
So there are many challenges in that. We know in relation to Restart that the capital outlay for reconfiguration will be a challenge for some companies, not all companies. It's one of the things that's leading us to review what we do with the current grant scheme, that if there is headroom within that, could that be repurposed and allocated again as business support, but for Restart in that area. I've also, it's a suggestion again I've made to the UK government about a month ago in relation to potential new funding streams in relation to Restart to help that practical reconfiguration, purchase of perspex, that kind of thing. There's obviously a challenge for everybody. A lot of companies are just getting on and doing it, because in this phase, for example, those companies that should be able to fully function in phase 2 can do the planning just now and to prep their premises ready for a safe return. And obviously in manufacturing, a lot of that's involving perspex, for example, in that reconfiguration. But your point is really well made about how do you do this profitably, and of course that's the point Gordon MacDonald made as well. I think in terms of physical distancing can actually challenge what the rate of return can be, and certainly in terms of advice and compliance, it's not just what a safe workplace looks like; it's how can you do it profitably. So we're working again with business leaders, entrepreneurs, who've got insight as to how this might be able to be done in a productive way. We're also learning from other countries. So many of our companies in Scotland have operations globally, and they've been able to provide us with insight as to how that might be done. So that's information sharing. The point I said about that advice compliance with HSE, it's not always about enforcement, it's actually about helping businesses work out how to do it. So that advice stream will become increasingly important as well. I can't give you a quantum in terms of funding as what might be available in any shape or form for Restart, but I do think that if we are doing that, we then have to make sure that people are making other changes to their businesses. So it's also about how can they restructure in a way that repurposes them, makes them more energy efficient, for example. Again, these are areas that is the Restart phase that we're moving into. Will have that Restart phase will have many challenges, but we're trying to mobilise the talents of Scotland to help businesses on the high street and indeed national businesses respond in that way. But the cost of that, we haven't been able to calculate on a national scale, but we will be working with sectors as they're working through it themselves. It's businesses themselves will know what this will require. But there's been far closer working with businesses, business organisations, trade unions than there's ever been before. And I think the strength of that partnerships is rapid delivery of guidance, for example, but also rapid response and intelligence as to how we can help businesses on the ground.
Okay, and I have one last one for you. Obviously, with some sectors like tourism, who are going to have a very slow restart by all accounts, it's not just businesses that consider themselves tourism businesses that are massively affected. So I think this week we've seen a large laundry business in the Highlands close its doors because obviously it was doing the laundry for many businesses across the area. Now, when you're thinking about how you support businesses, how are you thinking about the supply chain in terms of categorization? So if somebody is needing support, if their supply chain is a category that you're giving support to, are you going to enable them to be eligible for the same funding? Because clearly it is the supply chains that are going to collapse, and then reopening is going to be really problematic.
I think that's a critical question and a critical area. Right from the start, we identified that supply chains could be the real issue as to whether actually essential services that were still able to function during lockdown could work. And there was a lot of issues around trying to help the public understand that we can't have the essential services working if the supply chain that's supporting it aren't operating. And in terms also of of looking at the pivotal resilience fund, those companies that were they were viable before COVID, vulnerable now because of COVID, but vital to our economy. Supply chains were part of that as well, because that to us is a key area for restart. We won't be able to restart, and that's why I'm talking earlier on about energy supply chains as well. If we don't keep productive capacity in the supply chains, even if you've got companies that have got and can sustain demand and activity, if they can't function fully, then we're not going to get that integrated economic response as possible. It's maybe not an area that people get as interested or excited in terms of economic response or interested in the big companies doing the activity, but Scotland's economy, as you're well aware, is an SME economy. But we have really important supply chains, and it's also some of the pressures that will come when you have, and as will happen, and we know there are major companies, particularly in some of the aerospace and aviation areas, that are reconsidering what they're doing in terms of their activities, and not just in Scotland but globally. And we have to make the best case for Scotland as to why we want to be here. It's why advanced manufacturing is so important to us as that growth area. It's why we've announced the construction of the National Manufacturing Institute of Scotland, again another important construction piece of work that Morrison's will be carrying out, again activity in the economy. But why is that important? Because if we're going to compete well with our skill base, advanced manufacturing is really important, and that's where supply chains are critical. Because a good example of that is what Ivan McKee and the team is looking at repurposing for the private sector for procurement for the NHS has shown. That innovation can and should be used for the products that we need for the future. And if we can combine that with Rhoda Grant's point about youth, young people and youth employment, if we can marry that with apprenticeships that are in that area, then however difficult, and it will be difficult, I'm not underestimating the economic impact this is going to have on people and their livelihoods and their businesses, but we need to have some hope and growth. And I think if we look after our supply chains and we look after our manufacturing in key areas in tech and digital, we are going to be in a position where we can come through this, but come through in a much better position than we were previously.
Okay, so I take it from that then that the supply chains can apply for sectorial support if they in fact supply that support.
Yeah, I think that's going to be increasingly important. And understanding the supply chains, because they're quite complex as well, has been a real part of what our enterprise companies have been doing, and indeed my Scottish Government officials as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, is there anything anybody else wants to raise? I'm just checking my notes. I think we're Right, so I haven't got any further requests for questions. So I think we've reached the end, Cabinet Secretary. I think you've done. We've had a long session. I think there's some good conversations in there covered. I'm sure there'll be more in the future, but can I thank you, and can I thank your officers as well for coming along. Gary Gilespie, obviously we did hear from you, and thank you to Kevin Quinlan. We didn't actually hear from you at all, but I don't know whether there's anything you want to add before we close out. Are you there, Kevin?
Hi, no, Convener, I'm sure that you've covered the ground. That's fine.
Okay.
I almost brought him in the last question, maybe next time. Okay. And can I just thank the committee as well? I think our relationship's going to be really important. I know there's scrutiny, there's accountability, there's challenge. That's part of the democratic process. But I do think that your insight and what you can bring from your constituency, and indeed different party contacts and networks, are going to be important, because we're facing something that I don't think we've ever had to face, certainly at the time of devolution on this scale, but as we know, for many decades. So I will need you, as well as you, as well as all the talents that we have in Scotland, to try and get us through this and steer a path through.
Absolutely, and I think if we can have an open, honest and transparent approach to looking at these issues and scrutinising what we've got in front of us, will enable us as well to ensure that the information we're giving in our reports is both accurate and useful. So thank you again for attending. That brings us to the end of the public part of our committee. The committee will now move into private. So can I thank you all for watching and everybody for attending, and hopefully we'll see you again next week.